23rd of April 2010, I became a grandfather for the first time. Now, those of you who are grandfathers know what I'm talking about. Those of you who have not will not know that being grandfather is not a physical experience, it's not a psychological experience, it's an experience like no other. Prior to this date, as you've heard, I was a distinguished man. I was a man of whom could be said he knew a whole lot. He knew many things. He traveled all continents. He lectured all over the world. He's a man of letters, a man of influence, a man on television, CNN, BBC, name it. A man of distinction. Becoming a grandfather is a humbling experience. Over that time, I have changed and changed fundamentally. And I believe that if I don't understand humanity better, at least I understand it differently. That experience had led me to understand how my relationship with my own grandfather, my relationship between my daughter who's sitting here and my father meant. I began to think about all sorts of things. What is it that nature could have intended to allow old men like me, no longer useful in procreation, to continue on this earth? After all, as a biologist, I was taught that we only lived on this earth so that we could procreate, and after that, we were done. It seemed to me that there might be some value created in we as a human species having grandparents. As you'd expect, I decided to study the subject. It was exciting. That's my granddaughter laughing. I was so happy to be relevant. What a happy day it was for me to be relevant. So I went on to research the subject. And to my utter horror and surprise, I discovered that we had only existed as a grandparents for a mere 30,000 years. Most of you here present would either be dead. The design for man was very interesting. By the age of 15, you had the duty to start reproducing, reach sexual maturity, procreate as fast and furious as you can, and then die. To help you, most of the mothers died at childbirth in an arrangement that was really totally wasteful. That's my wife and I, and our first son at the age of 30, approximately. By this time, we would have known everything we needed to know and be on the way to the grave. Happily for us, and as more people lived longer, life experiences on survival became available to younger people. And that a young bride-to-be being advised by her parents, who are my friends as well. Now, going back 30,000 years, youngsters like yourselves here would have needed to be told what crops to plant and where to plant them. You'd have needed to know which fruit and vegetables were good to eat and what routes to take when hunting, either in Twitter or on Facebook. You would need men and women who'd been there before to tell you what are the best watering holes, be those for wine or for water itself. That's my father. Older people, it turns out, became the custodians of institutional memory and had to be consulted in times of conflict. They had been themselves through all manner of conflicts. Issues in those days about water sources, conflict between husband and wife, a job I have done with distinction in this life. And older people would know from personal experience, as I can attest to myself, about how to bring up some children and how to live in a marriage life. There were additional benefits, and this is important. For the survival of the species, it was necessary that knowledge and experience about how to bring up children be shared from one generation to the next. At the age of 30, you do not know much about, and I assure you it is true, about the tricks of dealing with a child who is having a seizure. Feeding methods were important and were very helpful. These are my friends. Young parents, because we, the grandparents, existed, and you will see why I'm going on this track for so long, gave you, the young people, opportunities to go out and do other things that were interesting and relaxing, in the knowledge that we, the loving grandparents, were there. When you study the history of humanity, you will find that as we, the grandparents, established ourselves in the society, new inventions like art and music and poetry made their appearance for the very first time. I submit to you, therefore, that without grandparents, this would be your fate. The rest of my lecture, which is going to be very fast and furious, is to tell you a little bit about what I have learned from this, my granddaughter.
Letter B.
And letter A.
Letter A.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's go on. I've learned to be patient as well. Now, coming back to my profession, I've been forced to go back to the drawing board and ask myself, why is it that immigrant communities in London have higher rates of mental illness? Why is it that in my own study in Africa, I could find no cases of anorexia nervosa? I compared Kenyan long-distance athletes with British ones and found that whereas 25% of British athletes had anorexia nervosa, none of my Kenyan girls had. I looked at my daughter lovingly, I can promise you, and wondered which rate will apply to her. Will she have biology take over? Will she have the environment take over from her? I looked further back into the 30s and looked at Norwegians who migrated to the United States and found that the whole process of migration conferred higher rates of mental illness. I looked back in the 18th, 19th century and found that it didn't really matter what happened to you. You migrated to another country and the rate of mental illness that you suffered were very high. And I look at you here and wonder, many of you have migrated. And I wonder to myself, I've been led to think other thoughts. I look at the whole concept of globalization, the big equalizer of all time, nonsense. I look at issues of infant mortality, 2.6 in Japan, 118 in Angola. What an equitable world we live in. I look at 100 people on earth, 6 own 59% of the global wealth. All are American. 80 live in poverty, mostly African. 70 cannot read. 1 has education. 1 has a computer. Global world? Dombisa Moyo is a subject of great admiration by myself. From 81 to 2000, the number of people in the continent, our continent, living in poverty almost doubled. Africa's real per capita income today is lower than it was in the 70s. Why, I ask, why? Africa has the highest proportion of poor people in the world. Why, I ask you? I have other thoughts. In 1973, the psychiatric classification systems in America classified homosexuality as a disease, and I was taught how to treat it. Schizophrenia and drug addictions, now we know, are disorders that we can treat that we can diagnose using methods of MRI and so on. They're structural conditions in the brain. Is there a time coming when we'll be able to immunize babies against depression, schizophrenia, drug abuse in the same way as we immunize children in Africa against whooping cough, measles, and other conditions? That's me at the Maudsley. A man of great talent, some of you will say. That's not all I was taught. I was taught that ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. How much of what I was taught at the Maudsley is nonsensically so? How many is what I am teaching today nonsense? I look at my granddaughter and I wonder to myself, what will happen to climate change over the next 60 years? It pains me to think that when she becomes a grandmother, as I become a grandfather, she may not have a world to live in. What will happen not only to grandfathers like me, but to my mother? What provisions are we making to mitigate the challenges of our own success? Those are the rates of Alzheimer's disease. By the age of 90, the rate goes up to 25%. I must now conclude, and I must give you some thoughts. First of all, let me assure you, and you must relax immediately, all of you, there is absolutely no greater pleasure or privilege and blessing I know than that of being a grandfather. Take it from me. However, that status comes with the great responsibility of making sure and anticipating the world that our grandchildren will live in. To do that effectively, one has to start preparing now. Learn from my mistakes. Think about not your generation, but about 2 or 3 generations to come. Plan not for 5-year government cycles, as we have done, making us in the protest invaders of national coffers, like invading armies, eating at resources like gluttons, out to kill each other. I fear my generation has let you down. So this is my question to you as I close. What are you doing, ladies and gentlemen, to prepare yourselves to be good and effective grandparents? I submit to you that no person should be a grandparent unless qualified for the role, not by words, but by your deeds. I'm reminded of the Magna Carta that provided that none could be punished other than the law of the land. A landmark decision. I am urging us to be participants in the changing of the way society conceives itself, particularly African society. And I am proposing to you that we start listening to the unborn. President Kibaki of Kenya, new social order for Kenya. I fear that we, as Africans today, are following the example of Idi Amin Dada and behaving like despots, consuming huge resources of oil and timber and forest, destroying the climate. I'm proposing this by way of challenging conventional wisdom, that grandparents of your generation, not mine, be entitled to argue on behalf of the unborn, of grandchildren. After all, by the time you become a grandchildren, the imperatives of consuming and of becoming rich and of becoming famous, hopefully, will have gone. And we'll be looking for a life of quiet retirement and can speak in a measure of confidence about what the future should look like. I would suggest that we put in place a system that allows for transgenerational planning, so that when I sit and discuss in Parliament, we are discussing what will happen not in the next generation, but for 3 generations after that. I'm saddened to recall that the purpose of writing was to facilitate enslavement of human beings by recording the numbers of sheep owed as taxes. It was never intended for the poor like you and us to write poetry, as we have heard here this afternoon, or to communicate bright ideas that I'm sure we will have the whole day. I would like you to do this. I urge you all to think not like Kenyan members of parliament, who are the highest paid members of parliament, because they can organize their own salaries for themselves. But I urge you to work for a parliamentary system, for a social management system that allows you to think 2 or 3 generations into the future. Ladies and gentlemen, if you can do that for us, my granddaughter and I will be very, very happy people, and we'll laugh until cows come home. I thank you.